Okay, well, very good. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Dave Ulrich. I am currently president of the EPA Alumni Association, and today we'll be moderating our very distinguished panel on international environmental activities to save the planet. We are very, very fortunate to have this group assembled. Before we get started formally, I would like to alert everyone to the opportunity to become a member of the EPA Alumni Association. If you served at EPA for uh, at least 1 year, and if you're still working, you can still join and be an associate member. And if you have retired or moved on to other locations, you can become a full member. It is the best deal in town because we have no dues, but we do ask for voluntary contributions usually every fall, and have been able to maintain a very stable treasury over the years. More Academy sessions coming up that might be of interest to you. On November 14th, we will have a session on lead in drinking water, focusing on Newark, New Jersey, and the particular way that unfolded in that community. On December 11th, we will have a focus on climate litigation, which I think will be of great interest to all of you. As I mentioned before, we have a very distinguished panel, and I would like to introduce all three of them first and then ask each of them to take about 10 minutes and tell us a little bit about the highlights of their careers, particularly in the international field. First, a name and face very familiar to a lot of you, Scott Fulton, who had a distinguished career at EPA in a number of senior management positions, and prior to that, worked with EPA from the Department of Justice and represented us, including our region out here in Chicago, in many of the enforcement activities that we were involved in. Since leaving EPA, Scott spent 6 years, 2015 to 2021, as the Environmental Law Institute's fifth president. He also did a stint with Beveridge and Diamond. He served a number of high-ranking positions at EPA, as I mentioned. Next, Jennifer Haverkamp, who is the Graham Family Director of the Graham Sustainability Institute at the University of Michigan. She is an internationally recognized expert on climate change, international trade, and global environmental policy and negotiations. Very impressive, Jennifer. What I really am impressed with as well is her sustainability-focused collaborations between students and faculty. I would guess that becomes a bigger challenge all the time within the university. And then externally, she works with a broad range of stakeholders, including communities, non-governmental organizations, government agencies, foundations, professional organizations, and the private sector. I'm a big believer in the importance of getting people together to solve environmental problems, and it sounds like Jennifer has a lot of expertise in that area. Our third panelist is Chuck Di Leva, who is Chief Counsel of the Environmental and International Law Practice Group in the World Bank Legal Vice Presidency. He is the legal advisor on climate change solutions in that area, and Environment and Natural Resources Global Practice Group. Since 1992, he's worked in all regions across the world, dealing with sustainable development, climate finance, and development and implementation of multilateral environmental agreements and national laws. He has represented the bank in international treaty negotiations in areas of climate, biodiversity, chemicals, and wetlands. I cannot imagine a more impressive group of people, and I greatly appreciate their willingness to share their insights and wisdom with us. I'm going to ask Scott to kick it off for us with a little bit of some highlights of his career in the international field. Scott, take it away.
Thanks, Dave, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with so many EPA friends and colleagues, even in virtual form. There's not a day that goes by that I don't remember with pride our time working together at EPA. And as it happens, out of all the things I had a chance to do at the agency, my work in the international sphere was perhaps the most rewarding of all. And this may be true for a number of you as well. There's just simply magic for sure, and working across cultures on common problems so strongly connected to a sustainable future here, there, and everywhere. So it's nice to have a chance to reflect on that body of work, especially with good friends and cherished colleagues like Dave and Chuck and Jennifer, who really were some of my favorite collaborators in the international space. The title of this program presupposes the importance of this work, but it may be worth reflecting ever so briefly on why we've been doing this work, what the nature of that work has been to date as we think about where it could or should go from here. I suppose the most obvious reason for international engagement by agencies like EPA, it's so obvious that it's almost trite to say at this point, is that the environment ignores national boundaries, and that many environmental problems are shared in meaningful ways across the world's nation states, either because of common problems or because actions in one country affect the environment or natural resources of another. But there are other drivers as well. For example, the idea of environmental diplomacy, the notion that working together on a common problem like the environment can help build relationships that can tackle even more intractable problems and lead to a broader peace. Irrespective of the underlying objective, I think EPA's international engagement over time have generally fallen into two principal categories. First, what might be called normative international work, that being working on multilateral or bilateral environmental agreements, model laws, and the like that seek to establish common norms and expectations built on international best practice. These agreements aim to provide common currency, if you will, on how best to create a sustainable future, as well as a more level playing field for international trade. Second, there is work to build capacity and institutions for environmental protection, particularly in the developing world, so that they're in a position to take on the hard work of environmental protection. And we all know how difficult that is, even in a well-developed system like our own. At times, this capacity building work can be seen as supporting implementation of bilateral or multilateral agreements. At times, it's undertaken because of the strategic importance of a key bilateral relationship. At times, it's undertaken to support free trade objectives. Lots of reasons to do it, and because of those reasons, EPA has done lots of it over the years. I think you'll see in the range of things that I did that I'll describe for you with the agency, indicia of the different drivers for international work, as well as both normative and capacity building dimensions of that work. So for me, this work was for many years an adjunct to other posts. And I think it started with high-level collaborations with the government of the Netherlands under the auspices of what was then a new international network for environmental compliance and enforcement, or INES. That was in 1990, shortly after I moved over to EPA's Office of Enforcement from the Justice Department. Heine was the brainchild of Cheryl Wasserman and a Dutch counterpart of hers, and proved to be a key platform for building enforcement capacity around the world. But my own kind of personal deeper dive started shortly thereafter in the context of collaborative work with the government of Mexico on the US-Mexican border in the early 1990s. As some of you will recall, concerns about rampant environmental noncompliance on the Mexico side of the border surfaced as a political obstacle to ratification of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And this led to a really interesting set of US-Mexico collaborations. One that stands out for me was an initiative that combined our jawboning with US parent companies of Mexican subsidiaries to push them to lean on their subsidiaries to clean up their south of the border operations. And with Mexico's companion promise, that we've sort of delivered these messages in a gathering where we were both present, of severe enforcement, including shutdown of factories and that sort of thing, in the event that the parent corporations did not bring their subsidiaries to heel on these points. That interaction and collaboration was surprisingly effective and helped clear out the enforcement piece of the NAFTA underbrush. And that work, I'd say, gave me the international bug in a complete way, and that bug would stay with me in my various roles in the agency in the years that would follow. In 1995, I moved from the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance over to OGC to be the Deputy General Counsel, and had a chance to work with a collective of Central American countries with the help of folks like Peter Lawless and Steve Wolfson in their efforts to develop environmental legislation. And this was just a remarkable opportunity to influence and inform the legal infrastructure across that region for environmental protection, and helped build a framework of comparable laws and comparable institutions that continues to pay benefits today in terms of both environmental protection results and trade normalization within that region and with us. In the late 1990s, I was invited to be part of an environmental law and enforcement project under the Middle East peace process. This was another fascinating bit of work that had me in the Middle East regularly over the course of several years, and that was headed towards the establishment of a regional environmental hub in Amman, Jordan. Something the United States very much supported, until the overall peace process collapsed in the summer of 2000, wiping out that body of work, all the progress we had made, the dreams of peace that seemed to be shared by the Israelis and Palestinians, Egyptians and Jordanians with whom we were working. In the early 2000s, as a judge on the Environmental Appeals Board, I was drawn into a project by UNEP to build capacity of judges around the world for environmental adjudication. The early expression of this was a first ever global judicial symposium on environmental law in 2002, hosted by South Africa, presided over by the Chief Justice of South Africa, with participation by none other than Archbishop Desmond Tutu. That was the beginning of a process that would see a collective of judges, of which I was a part, producing a judge's handbook on environmental law for use around the world. Would take me to every region of the world to collaborate with and essentially train judicial counterparts, and would ultimately lead to the formation of the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment, an association of judges focused on the association of judges for judges focused on the judicial contribution to a sustainable future. The last thing I'll mention here is that in the last few years of the George W. Bush administration, our friend Jerry Clifford, who was the acting assistant administrator of the Office of International Affairs at that time, asked me to come be his deputy. I made the move away from the Environmental Appeals Board, but Jerry retired shortly after I got there, much to my surprise. And I found myself the acting AA for OIA for the last year plus of the Bush administration and most of the first year of the Obama administration. I changed roles with Team Obama as things went along, but I stayed actively involved in a number of things, most importantly among them the strategic economic dialogue with China, of which environmental law and policy was an important part. Here again, EPA had an incredible opportunity to influence the development of China's environmental law and policy infrastructure. And troubled though the U.S.-China relationship has become, those engagements not only improved China's ability to protect its domestic environment, but they also provided a benchmark for other developing and transitioning economies on how to do this work of environmental protection, and made possible the 2015 U.S.-China Climate Accord, which in turn made possible the Paris Climate Agreement. So that's some of the work that I've had the privilege of doing along the way. Some of it has followed me after my retirement from government, but I'll stop there so the others can share their stories.
Very good, Scott. Thanks very much. What a wide-ranging set of experiences you had, and I'm glad you're here with us to share some of those. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer Haverkamp from the University of Michigan to share a little bit of her experiences as well. Jennifer?
Thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure to have been invited to be part of this process and to see some old friends and colleagues' names in the list of people on this call today. It's really not fair to have to go after Scott, but I've also been operating in this space for a long time and have some experiences and some highlights to share, as Dave invited us to do. While I'm now here at the University of Michigan and have been here for about 6 years, EPA is never far from my mind, in part because my very next door neighbor works at the Ann Arbor National Vehicle and Fuel Emissions Laboratory here in Ann Arbor. But anyway, and in addition to running the institute that Dave described, I also teach at the law school and have a position at the School of Public Policy as well. So I've made the transition to being an academic, but my environmental career, I got into international work kind of serendipitously fairly early in the process, but I started my federal experience at the Department of Justice, the Lands, now the Environment Division, and working, perhaps not coincidentally, with both Chuck and Scott when we were all in DOJ together. So been colleagues and friends for a long time. Then I followed Scott and Bob Van Hubelen over to EPA. So I would qualify, though barely, to be a member of the Alumni Association. I was a special assistant in OECA, the Office of Enforcement and Compliance, with an office right next door to Scott Fulton. But at that time, while Scott was running around doing some of the great work you heard about, and people like Dan Esty were helping Administrator Riley to get the president to go to Rio and to sign the UN Climate Change Framework Agreement, I was doing domestic work. But then this opportunity showed up where a colleague had been on loan from DOJ to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and she was being called back home to DOJ and asked me if I was interested in going to USTR. And I had no international environmental experience. I had no international trade experience, but it just sounded like a really interesting opportunity. And so I went on detail from EPA, and every day was interesting, and I ended up staying for 10 years. where I rose after a couple of years to be the head of the newly created Office of Environment and Natural Resources at USTR. And when I say every day was interesting, it's because this was when the environmental world and the trade world discovered each other, and they did not like what they found. So we had, this was, if anybody remembers the days of tuna dolphin, when it turned out that the trade laws would let Mexico challenge a US law that prohibited imports of tuna that was caught in a manner that harmed dolphins. It was when we were negotiating the NAFTA, and there was the fear of jobs going to Mexico because the environmental laws were weak. There were people and public citizens saying that NAFTA would cause breast cancer because of the pesticides on the fruits and vegetables. It was just a lot of controversy and drama, and a need to figure out how to navigate these two different worlds. And so I was in a place where we ran an interagency process of all the relevant federal agencies, including colleagues from EPA, to figure out our positions in negotiations and litigation. I should have gone back to say that as soon as I got to USTR, I was thrown onto a team negotiating the environmental side agreement to the NAFTA. A team that was led by Alan Hecht, co-led by Alan Hecht, and a counterpart from the State Department. And Dave, you asked about highlights of our careers. I do think that was a real highlight of my career. It was just an incredible experience of seeing how we would find our common ground with counterparts in Mexico and Canada, how we were bringing the environmental perspective into these trade negotiations for the first time, and then how we had to work with the environmental organizations, with the companies, and then to get NAFTA approved by Congress, and all the work that went into that. And NAFTA has kind of a mixed reputation today, and we can go into that if people want to in the Q&A, but it still felt like a real accomplishment to finish that agreement and to lift up the standard of living of a lot of people working in Mexico in particular. So that was good. Another thing while I was at USTR that was quite interesting, and I worked closely with EPA folks on, was an executive order that required doing environmental impact assessments of international trade agreements. And that was eventually endorsed in legislation. So that's a common practice now in trying to, again, think early in the process of these trade negotiations about what the environmental implications are, how you can make the environmental benefits part of the process, how to use the trade agreement as leverage for greater environmental cooperation between countries. Fast forward, probably the real highlight of my career in international environmental work came late in the Obama administration. Along the way, I'd left the government. I spent 7 years leading the International Climate Program for Environmental Defense Fund, where I led teams going to all of the UN climate conferences between Bali in 2007 and till I left, and I went into the government at the State Department. I had a position as the special representative for environment and water resources, kind of a fancy title for being put in charge of leading the negotiating teams for two of the climate agreements that we completed in 2016. One is the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, and the other is called CORSIA, which is an agreement in the International Civil Aviation Organization, where it requires countries to have their airlines limit their emissions for global civil aviation to a 2019 baseline, and then acquire offsets for any emissions above that. So I can talk about both of those more in the Q&A if you'd like to, but I think my big takeaways from that for purposes of this conversation were how important the interagency teams were to develop the US negotiating positions and persuade other countries of the rightness of our positions where we could, to find the common ground. On the Kigali Amendment, Cindy Newberg at EPA, who runs the HFC program, was just a force. And I think one of the things that that made my work go well. I was one small piece of it, of a whole team of people. But coming in at that point in my career as a political appointee, I'd had enough of a career as a civil servant that I knew to listen to people, to trust their expertise, to defer to them where I needed to. It wasn't like, you know, I'm coming in with all my ideas and these people don't know what they're doing. They're just bureaucrats. So I think that was a lesson I learned through my years of being in the federal government. The other thing was just how successful we were in both those fora, because you had alignment in many of the issues between the business community and the environmental organizations, where in both the Montreal Protocol and its amendments and in the Civil Aviation Agreement, the companies had reasons why they wanted to see us reach agreement and be successful as well. And I could go on and on about how different that is from my experience in the UN climate agreements in the UNCCC, where there are so many different players and so many mixed motives of the people around the table and the groups lobbying around on the outside. I think that I'm eager to get to the Q&A and to hear about Chuck's experience, so I'm going to stop there.
Very good. Thank you, Jennifer. Chuck, tell us a little bit about your experiences, World Bank and otherwise.
Thanks, Dave. You know, it was interesting because there's so many things that Scott and Jennifer mentioned that brought back memories. One of which, Jennifer and I actually shared a boss after we left DOJ in the form of Bob Zellick, who was both U.S. trade rep and he was also the president of the World Bank for a number of years. And I think we could probably spend the rest of the day talking about Bob Zellick stories. He was a great leader at the World Bank. I also, Jennifer used the word serendipity, and it's also the case for me because I never expected to have an international career. I was very happy at the Department of Justice representing the distinguished agency known as EPA. So I'm actually an interloper because I never worked for EPA. It was just my client. But because I had spent a year working for the UN Environment Program in Nairobi, while I was working in the environmental enforcement section under the wonderful David Buente, who recently left us far too soon, I asked David if I could combine my enforcement work with an international angle. Namely, I was recognizing that we were having more transboundary cases. There was pollution coming in from Canada, there was pollution coming in from Mexico. There were defendants who would be overseas. So David appointed me as the coordinator for international issues in EES. And so I put together notebooks, I think they still have them there, on how to deal with Hague Convention, service of process and discovery. Worked with Annie Petzock on a case with a Canadian polluter up in Michigan that received a lot of note. But that experience that I had in Nairobi brought me to the attention of the World Bank, because they were under a lot of criticism for not having adequate environmental focus due to some large infrastructure projects. And with the Rio conference big on the international scene in 1992, they wanted to add an environmental lawyer into the general counsel's office. So I went over as the first American environmental lawyer there. And it was taking off the hat of someone who proudly represented the United States for a number of years to becoming an international servant, with the US being on the other side as a partner, right? Because the US is the largest shareholder in the World Bank, the most influential member in the World Bank. It still has the largest shares in the World Bank. But I had to recognize that the US was one of 189 member governments, and important to collaborate with, but also to recognize the viewpoints that were coming from the bank client countries. And so really the shift was from a career on the environmental side to a career responsible for advancing the environment in a development institution. So it was that combination of looking at the development goals of the 100 World Bank member borrowing countries, with the aspiration that much of which was being led by the US for the rest of the world in terms of recognizing the critical environmental issues that were at such forefront in 1992. So the World Bank, which had been, I think, pretty much surprised by this strong language from civil society about not doing enough for the environment, became very interested in following the climate negotiations, the biodiversity negotiations. And so the way the World Bank flag was set up in the UN in those days, I was usually sitting in the World Bank seat behind the US delegation. And the legal department was influential enough in the World Bank that it was me and my boss at the time who were representing the bank during those negotiations. And the bank was a big player in the treaty negotiations because everyone realized that the only way to achieve the environmental goals at the international level that we're talking about today was to find ways to provide funding for the developing world to meet those environmental objectives. So there was constant discussion about what the role of the World Bank was in terms of helping fulfill a lot of the environmental goals, including the capacity building elements that Scott was referring to earlier. And that led me to become sort of the advisor to the presidents of the bank on what these treaties meant for the bank. And it also gave me the opportunity to participate in the first, we call them missions, we don't call them trips in the bank, the first missions that the World Bank would take to borrower countries to develop their national environmental action plans. And the US was very supportive of this in its role as on the board of the bank, that if we're bringing countries along for development, let's be sure that they have an environmental action plan about how they're going to do development in a way that does not lead to further degradation of the environment. So some of my first trips, one that still I recall, was flying into Hanoi in 1993 on one of the first missions of the World Bank to develop a national environmental action plan with Vietnam so that we could help start supporting the environmental legislation, very often of which US EPA was having a big role in develop. And I can remember flying in the first time and still seeing the craters from US bombs at the Hanoi that were alongside the landing strip in Hanoi, and thinking how historic this was, that we were using environmental ambition as a way to bring countries together. And I think that resonates with what Scott was saying before, which is with all the problems the US has geopolitically, and the fact that there is this fracturing of a unipolar world into a multipolar world, environment still offers those opportunities for diplomacy with China, with India, and many other parts of the world. And so that work that I think EPA and state and other agencies and Treasury have been doing for so long is still vital. I think it's still recognized by the borrowing countries of the world that the US can still be a critical player in dealing with all of these issues. Other highlights for me were the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, helping represent the bank as a supporting largest source of multilateral public sector finance for the climate regime, for the biodiversity regime. And it continues to this day that the bank is the largest source of finance to support those treaties. And that external work on the treaty side was coupled with the work I did internally to deal with issues of how the institution sets environmental policies at the project level. So one of the things that I was most proud of was that I led the legal department in the development of a new environmental and social framework that took us 4 years to develop. Every US agency was involved in commenting as part of the negotiations for that environmental and social framework. And at the end of the day, that framework became the one leading what all development institutions are using today when they're carrying out investment activities at the project level in countries around the world. That is, in shorthand, it's known as the ESF, and it was really sort of just a daily engagement with U.S. Treasury, with Department of Labor, EPA, State Department in getting that together, because then it represents the standards for other development banks as well. The other element that was a major part of my work was helping develop carbon market activities within the bank. Very interesting. You know, one of the issues we wanted to discuss a little bit today is where are we on net zero? Where are we on a lot of climate goals? Even today, the World Bank President Banga, like Bob Zoellick, I think, saw a role for the bank in helping ensure that the private sector finds ways to get involved in supporting climate finance. And we launched a lot of these carbon funds in the 1990s. Colleagues of mine continue to work on trying to improve carbon markets today. And so it was another part of the work that I think I was very proud of in supporting these various carbon funds to get off the ground. And then finally, I think I'll just say on the capacity building side, this is one where we often worked hand in hand with US agencies, not just EPA, but for example, when we were working on developing West Africa fisheries projects, a US Coast Guard would help, because one of the big challenges today and why environmental law is not succeeding as envisioned at the Rio conference in 1992 is because developing countries in which most of the world's natural resources are located still lack adequate support for rule of law. US EPA, US State Department, USAID has tried working in many of these countries, but the job's not done. And one of the things that I worry about that was not so prominent when I started my career in this field is that we're actually facing huge debt issues today in the developing world. And with debt levels having skyrocketed after COVID, a lot of these environmental ambitions that I think EPA and the World Bank continue to share are at risk because of debt. The climate goals, environmental goals are going to be very difficult to achieve unless developing countries have a way to afford the added cost that comes when we're making this transition to a cleaner environment. So I'll leave it there, Dave.
Great. Thanks very much, Chuck. I think considering all three of you and what you have shared with us, there is no doubt but that the magnitude, complexity, and extent of international environmental challenges are quite substantial. I'd like to turn to Scott for the first question and then have Jennifer and Chuck chime in on it. Through your experience, obviously, you encountered some impediments along the way. Chuck, you just referred to a few of them now. But Scott, tell us a little bit about what impediments you see now and into the future, and how we might best approach those to overcome them. And again, then I'll ask Jennifer and Chuck to chime in as well. Scott?
Okay, Dave. Yes, of course, lots of impediments encountered along the way, and some situations where investments of time and energy by EPA have borne only kind of short-term results, and only to see things kind of revert back to where they were. So, just a few observations on challenges in this space, and one is that. As difficult as it can be to consummate an international agreement or a bilateral agreement, it's much harder still to implement those agreements. And in terms of why that is, I think it's fundamentally the absence of buy-in to the imperative by those who need to change or need to execute the change. These are basically top-down instruments, and the delta between the top and sort of the bottoms-up approach that's ultimately needed for behavioral change can be vast, and it can be difficult, which leads to a second observation, which is that education is really key to bottoms-up embrace, and really needs to be part of every top-down initiative, and it's often missing. Some of that education is capacity building, but some of it is also popular education as to why this matters, so that the imperative is socialized in a way that leads to buy-in. A third point is that government institutions, as we have witnessed over and over again, are actually quite fragile and are so subject to the shifting winds of politics as to be somewhat unreliable partners over the long haul. And you really need look no further than the in again, out again presence of the United States in the Paris Agreement for a homey example of this. But other countries, or most of them, are even less reliable partners because of political change, which has led to discontinuity in programming and resources for this work. And as I said before, wasted investments in capacity building. If the trained staff don't stick around, then you really haven't accomplished very much. A fourth point is that there are externalities that enter into this space that are confounding and are difficult, and in some ways much harder than our subject matter. And in particular, the problem of public integrity and corruption in so much of the world. Without public integrity, you really don't get a reliable picture of what's even happening with respect to the environment. There's really no basis for confidence that there'll be seriousness of purpose brought to the challenges at hand. And when corruption is a big societal or cultural problem in a place, that can be as vexing as anything else, which kind of begs a response, which is that needs to be part of the programming, that needs to be part of the thought, and we need to make sure that that's kind of worked into the equation. And we may get around to talking about ways to get around some of these obstacles, but I thought I'd just mention, because it came to mind, that there are examples of of ways to ensure sort of meaningful and secure investments in the international space. Like the Millennium Challenge Corporation has what I think is kind of an excellent sieve that they push all of their projects through, which really focuses on the question of, if we invest in this particular place, will that investment bear fruit? Are the institutional arrangements present that make that a secure investment, so the resources don't kind of disappear through the shifting sands of corruption? So there are ways about it, but the key is to recognize that it's an issue, and make sure that we've got some programming that is lined up to contend with it. So I'll stop there.
Very good, Scott. Jennifer, thoughts you might have, reactions to Scott's comments?
Scott covered a lot of the issues that I would have addressed, but a couple additional ones that I might add. Looking at the nature of international law today and how we create these international agreements and institutions, what are the levers and incentives for governments to live up to the commitments that they make? And I heard the Chief Justice of the International Court of Justice recently say that international law used to be about governments negotiating agreements with each other with obligations to each other. And that's true in many areas of international law still. But for things like climate change, which is a common concern of all humankind, it's more like the government's obligations aren't to the other governments. It's the government's collective obligation to all the people of the world. And that's a different calculus that they make. And there aren't necessarily the same incentives for governments to put effort into addressing these issues unless they risk significant, say, social unrest in their country, which has, been some of why China got very serious about air pollution. I think it's also very much the case that, as Chuck was saying, the issues around international financing of environmental issues, especially for not only helping countries meet their obligations, but helping with the adaptation or the resilience to the harms that are being caused. The magnitude of those costs are way beyond what national foreign direct assistance is ever going to cover. And so it really requires international institutions like the bank. It requires mobilizing the private sector. It requires figuring out where people can make money in the solutions to actually move that money, because it's not something you can just sit back and wait for national treasury departments to address. Those are a couple.
Thanks, Jennifer. Chuck, anything to add to what Scott and Jennifer have said? And unmute yourself. There you go. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything that's been said, and I think we need to recognize that part of the problem with these global agreements is there's winners and losers. And I believe that we have some very well-endowed petrostates that don't see themselves as losers due to climate change. Now, maybe that's because they don't have the right science. Maybe it's just because of short-termism, but that's a big part of trying to get a dealing with a global commons issue. I think it's a lot easier when you're talking about charismatic species like under CITES, although of course you have the challenges there. But climate change has proven to be the most difficult of them all, and including the fact that when President Obama launched the notion that there should be $100 billion available for developing countries by the year 2020. When he said that in 2009, that was already too little to deal with the needs, and is seen by the developing world, where the growing source of emissions and the natural resources are mostly located, as not nearly dealing with the equities of carbon deposits since 1850. So we're not even close to dealing with that issue as far as developing countries are concerned. So the way, I think, as Jennifer indicated, that we're trying to deal with it is to create incentives for private capital to make up that gigantic gulf between what governments are willing to put in and what's needed to change to a clean energy economy. And one of the concerns I have is that for the last several years, multilateral development banks have been trying to create this de-risking situation for private capital to move. My understanding is, depending on which way the election goes, those incentives that are being structured in the multilateral development banks may not be there in the future. So without that kind of incentive from the public sector, multilateral finance, hopefully there's bilateral finance through agencies like DFC as well. If you don't have that, there's no way you're getting to the targets that we're aiming for.
Very good. Thank you, Chuck. Jennifer, I'm going to give you the first shot at this next question, and that is what U.S. interests are advanced by engaging in environmental protection globally? And I think your experience on the trade representative would give you some particular insights in that. But what are your thoughts on that, Jennifer?
Well, I mean, I think I touched on it in my answer before, which is that quite a few of the environmental problems that are being dealt with through international agreements are shared global problems, whether it's the hole in the ozone layer, whether it's biodiversity and global biodiversity, whether it's the high issues around the global commons of the high seas or Antarctica, or climate change, where no matter where a ton of carbon or a greenhouse gas is emitted, it has the same impact around the whole world. So in part, it's in the US interest to work to help solve those problems because it redounds back to our own people and the reasons that it values humanity to have biodiversity and clean air and clean water and limit global warming. But I think that there are also, we talked about environmental diplomacy. It's very much the case, as Scott was saying, that even where countries can be very far apart on other issues, environmental issues can be a place where there can be common ground. Kind of like space was for the US and the Soviet Union back during the Cold War. That was an area where there was actually collaboration when we were still pointing warheads at each other. And I think that it's the case now. It's come and gone over the last few years, but the US-China relationship has been a great example of where finding common ground to talk about environment, to talk about climate change, to talk about reducing HFCs were a way to keep that relationship going. And also, frankly, because the US is such a large player in these issues, if other countries don't see the US taking these issues seriously, they don't have anywhere near the same incentive to follow suit. Again, looking at climate as an example, it was these repeated bilateral announcements by the US and China together. We are coming out with our NDC. We agree that we're going to work to eliminate HFCs under the Montreal Protocol, that then gave other countries the confidence to go ahead with those negotiations and make their own commitments, because the two biggest players in the room were saying together that we were going to act in this space.
Thanks, Jennifer. Chuck, some perspectives on U.S. interests here?
Well, just the connection with the impediment aspect. I mean, I think it's in the U.S. interest that when you look at the part of the reason, or maybe the reason why China now leads the world in terms of the amount of renewables that it's generating every year, is because it became a country with a significant middle class. And there was a clear interest in the people living in Beijing to deal with pollution, and they had the economic means to do it. What we have in so many other parts of the world is the inability to finance this transition. You know, there was a big, John Kerry led at Glasgow the discussion on just energy transition partnership, which is a great initiative. The problem is there's not nearly enough money for the countries to make that transition that was launched in Glasgow. So it's in the US interest to find, and it's interesting because you'd almost hear the same thing that John Kerry is saying that you would hear from a Larry Fink, which is that it's in the interest of the US for capital markets to embrace the notion of moving to a cleaner world. So opening up those kinds of incentives, I think that's what Janet Yellen has been doing. That's been sort of her nonstop call for the last couple of years, is to have what they call an evolution in how you look at the global financial markets supporting the ambition of these wonderful environmental treaties that were never properly funded. So I think that's in the US interest.
Scott, any additional thoughts?
I think we've covered most of it. Maybe just one example from the China experience. There was a project that we undertook at the Environmental Law Institute called the China International Business Dialogue on Environmental Governance. Kind of a mouthful, but I noticed that we funded this project with donations from interested parties, if you will. One of those interested parties was a fossil fuel company. I'll not mention the name, even though they deserve some credit for supporting the work. But what was striking to me was their explanation of why they were giving money to the Environmental Law Institute to teach China on how to regulate properly. And what they said to me was, it's really, really important. They said, our concern is not really China as much as it is India and other parts of Asia. And we think that what happens in a place like China is going to be just set down a marker for how this kind of thing will be approached in countries whose economies are transitioning. And that was their explanation. So there is something to this idea that what we're building is kind of additive in some ways, and that the more we can share the U.S. experience, which I think we'd all agree on the whole has been positive rather than negative, even though it's quite difficult in ways to do it the way that we've done it. With as much of the world as we can, and hope that will be taken up in a way that kind of leads to kind of a common international language on environmental protection and what that means and how to do it. So that's the only other additional point I would add.
Very good, Scott. Chuck, I'm going to ask you to take the lead on this next one. We've heard a lot about the impediments and about U.S. interests in this. Really interested in your perspective, as well as the other panelists, on, what are the central and key ingredients to success, and whether it's multilateral or bilateral strategies or agreements or negotiations. In your experience, what have you seen as the key ingredients to success?
Well, stability with the governing entity is pretty key. I think Scott earlier mentioned the fact that, we've had situations where we've worked several years on developing a really good, for example, land administration project in a country And just as it's about to unroll, you get a new government that comes in, and that's the end of that. That's not their priority. So shifting political priorities are things that need to be addressed. The other is there's a combination of principles that everybody recognizes as key for success. They include transparency, accountability, integrity. And depending on what sector you're working in, they each boil down to some very just basic practical steps. I mean, I think one of the things that the US led, going back, I mean, it was the US that convinced the European Union and the rest of the world to create a market for carbon pollution in the Kyoto Protocol. The US was always the leader in espousing that the way to get environmental goods to move and environmental bads to be pushed out was to create a price on such goods or bads. And what we've seen in a lot of recent reporting in the New York Times, New Yorker, Washington Post, is that markets only operate when they have integrity, when they have transparency, when they have clear reporting requirements. And recently, finally, after 4 years, and the Paris Agreement Article 6 body that's been working on trying to create rules for carbon markets, they've just issued their rules. In addition, US Treasury and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission has just issued guidance on having credible carbon markets. And now we need to have them operate in a way that it's like any other standard business that we've had, auditing, financial transparency, to make them succeed. And the problem was, Kyoto Protocol failed because the clean development mechanism didn't have suitable reporting requirements. A lot of the projects generated what were called hot air. So if we're going to get to net zero, and it's pretty obvious that all the multinationals are depending on offsetting schemes to get to net zero, we have to bring integrity, accountability, transparency into that whole process. I would say that those are key for success, at least for that aspect of environmental finance going forward.
Thanks, Chuck. Scott, your perspectives on this?
Yeah, I think if we could stay on climate change for a moment. We talk about climate change as a whole of society problem that calls for a whole of society solution. And yet, we continue to look to governments as though it is principally government's responsibility to solve this problem for the whole of society. And governments, for better or worse, in my estimation, are proving not up to the task. The competition between short-term imperative and longer-term aspiration is always leaning in the direction of the short-term needs, and it kind of leaves by the wayside the investment that's needed to make progress on something like this. So that's kind of led me to a surprising place. I'm sure as most of us were regulators, and I always carried a pretty healthy skepticism of the good intentions of the business community when it came to the environment. And in the early days of our work, it felt like we had to go to battle to get the business community to do anything relative to the environment. But one of the bits of learning for me, and after I retired from EPA and did some work for a private firm, was that the companies that I was working with actually had a much stronger sense of purpose on the question of environment than I had given them credit for. And there are a whole bunch of reasons for that, shareholder initiatives and other things that have kind of forced into the DNA of most companies. So some seriousness of purpose on environment, and then the sustainability movement within the business community and the environment, social and governance safeguards movements or ESG. All of these things make the business community a logical place to look as an assist in dealing with a problem where governments are on the whole kind of failing to take care of it. And there's power there when you consider the reach of that business power through supply and value chains to enterprises that are all over the world. If we could arrive at a place where we were optimizing more completely that private sector reach and inducement, it would lighten the lift for governments. So that's one thought I would share.
Jennifer, anything to add there on keys to success?
I think I would build on especially what Scott was saying, but take it to the concrete example of some international negotiations I was part of, where you see the constructive role that the private sector can play. I think we've all heard that one of the most significant climate impacts we have is every time we get on an airplane. Well, the airline industry is consumer facing, and they, I think we're ahead of a lot of other sectors in realizing that if they weren't seen as part of the climate solution, it could really affect their business down the road, their ridership, things like that. And so when we were negotiating the agreement in the International Civil Aviation Organization, it was the industry and the trade associations who were huge advocates and supports of completing this deal. Part of it was that they did not want to have a whole checkerboard of different requirements that they had to meet. And the EU had gotten tired of waiting on ICAO to come up with requirements for airlines. And so the EU had set their own rules as part of their emissions trading system that flights coming in from other countries had to obtain allowances to cover their emissions above a certain level. And so there was this fear that there were going to be all sorts of different requirements, and their concern about ridership. Things like, I don't know if you've heard the expression Flugscham, which is flight shaming. And there's an alternative that I can't pronounce, which is called train pride in Europe for, people taking the more sustainable route. But anyway, during these negotiations, if we were having trouble getting a certain country to be more constructive in the negotiations, the International Trade Association would go to their national member and say, you need to get your government on board with this. So there was just a lot of that kind of leverage that I found very interesting. And then the other thing that helps when talking about what are key ingredients to success in my career in international negotiations, the US being an active player has always been a significant part of the process. Even if other countries are waiting around to see what we propose so they know they can oppose it, there's still often the dynamic of what is the US trying to do in this? And especially again, in some of these negotiations in the final years of the Obama administration, where the administration had decided, like in 2016, that its goals were to complete the Kigali Amendment negotiations, to complete the aviation agreement, and to get to entry into force of the Paris Agreement. And that was a huge high-level push across the State Department, across cabinet officers and deputy cabinet officers. As John Kerry was traveling the world for everything else he was doing as Secretary of State, he would say, okay, I'm meeting with President so-and-so. What should I tell them about the Kigali Amendment? And so you had the force of the leadership of the United States making it happen, which doesn't always happen. So those are just a few examples from my experience.
No, that's very helpful, Jennifer. This concept of somebody's got to put their cards on the table, so there's something to react to, positive or negative, and certainly a fundamental element of negotiations. All of you have referred to the potential roles of the private sector, and we had a question come in as to the role of the insurance industry and how they might be able to contribute to this effort. Scott, you want to take a shot at that one first, and then the others?
Yeah, I think that is a natural place to look, and I think if we were to kind of look under the tent there, we actually would see a fair amount of thinking being done about how to ensure sort of a sustainable model in that sector. One of their challenges, and this is something, a recurring challenge across the business community, is that the sort of the antitrust rules discourage to some degree collaboration and commonality of approach between competitor entities. And I'm not sure exactly what to do about that. And of course, we don't want to sort of enter a sphere of non-competitive actions and activities. But this does kind of slow down progression on sectoral approaches to driving these ideas. I mean, the insurance industry, of course, has got a huge amount of self-interest when it comes to severe weather events and that sort of thing. And that's going to force them to be making choices, perhaps ahead of some other sectors, in terms of how to manage their resources and to whom to offer or provide coverage. But they are also part of this broader pressure within the private sector to ensure that their business model is consistent with sustainability ideals, and to make sure that they are not themselves a contributor to circumstances that call into question whether they will be sustainable in the years to come.
Chuck, any thoughts on the insurance industry and what they might do?
I think it's fascinating because, you know, we're supposed to be a free market country. And yet over the last few years, we see that when investment firms want to steer their investment toward firms that have environmental, social issues as a focus, or in the case of some states, when insurance companies want to limit where they have to write policies to because public officials are allowing construction in areas where they shouldn't build, suddenly we're not free market. And I think this is going to come to a head because at some point business is going to just refuse to be to have to expose themselves to investment decisions that don't take into account the uncomfortable fact that many of the places where we live now are going to be increasingly difficult to live in, or that certain types of investments lead to stranded assets. So, you know, we'll see. We won't know tomorrow, but we're going to know at some point.
Jennifer, your thoughts?
I have nothing to add. Let's keep going.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. Another question that came in on the chat had to do with NAFTA and the Commission on Environmental Cooperation. And after 30 years, what's your assessment? And I guess that's going to be up in 2026 for some renegotiations. And obviously the outcome next month is going to have a big influence on that. But looking over the last 30 years on NAFTA and CEC, what's your assessment on this? Jennifer, do you want to take the first crack at that?
Sure. I would say that it's it's probably fair that at least some constituencies' hopes for the CEC were hard to meet. It was created as a forum for cooperation across the US, Canada, and Mexico. And because it was created in conjunction with this three-country trade agreement, there was some expectation that it would focus on the environmental issues related to trade. But every time an environmental issue related to trade was something that they thought they wanted to take on as a commission among the three environment ministers, the country's three trade ministers would say, wait a minute, that's our portfolio, get away. And so it was not, at least in some areas, well structured to carry out some of that work. It's also the case that where there was hope that the governments would then be held accountable for enforcing their environmental laws, again, because it was sort of just three countries and each country's governments were picturing, well, what if we're on the receiving end of that scrutiny? There was not as much of the government to government accountability as had been hoped for. You also, if you look at the mechanism that was negotiated for that, it was incredibly convoluted because there was such a desire by these governments not to ever actually be held accountable. When you look at evolution over time, the side agreement was something of a template for side agreements in later bilateral and regional trade agreements. And some of those obligations were eventually brought in as chapters of the trade agreement. And some of those are more effective where they are now subject to the same dispute settlement mechanism as any other violation of the trade agreement. And you have seen some good examples of in these later agreements, or even the USMCA, which is NAFTA 2.0, where these mechanisms are having some impact. There was, I don't remember the exact procedural details, but the US has raised concerns about Mexico's not protecting the vaquita well enough in Baja California, which is this incredibly endangered small porpoise mammal. You had in the agreement between the US and Peru, a very elaborate side agreement that the US managed to get Peru was required by that agreement to create an independent environmental agency for monitoring illegal logging. A few years ago, the Peruvian government tried to dismantle that entity. And under the trade agreement, the US came back and said that would be a violation of your obligation, and they reinstated it. So there are some positive examples, but we could have an entire session on what's the appropriate role of trade agreements for advancing environmental protection. But
we'll save that for another day, Jennifer, I guess. Scott, assessment of NAFTA and CEC?
Yeah, I think there were problems with the CEC architecture, including the citizen complaint process. It always seemed to me that the tendency of some of these complaints had the tendency to suck all the air out of the room and kind of steal away from the governments the question of how they might move forward together. Instead, they were constantly playing defense with one another, and each one of these complaints was kind of a diplomatic exercise for the reasons that Jennifer mentioned. If if the United States votes against Mexico here, or sort of lines up with the complaint, then what's going to happen next time around when the complaint is centered on something that's happening in the United States? And there's something about that mechanism that didn't work very well, and caused the focus of the enterprise to they have a fair amount of drift. And I'll also mention, I mean, it's just sort of a curious thing from a bureaucratic standpoint that the CEC was one of the international platforms where EPA had primacy, more or less, vis-a-vis the other organs of foreign policy in the United States government, including the State Department. And because of that, there was also this kind of institutional antipathy coming from the State Department. My good friends at the State might disagree with me on this, but it always seemed this way to me, that the full intention of the United States government was never really present in the CEC context, because we were kind of a divided house, if you will. You know, I'm sure this onion could be peeled in lots of different ways, but I think the general view is it didn't work so well, so let's not do it quite that way again next time.
The turf issues between EPA and state were very evident in the 90s and aughts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to stir up trouble like Scott is doing. But if we had time, I would ask Jennifer if she thinks that Mexico's decision to overturn the way judges are selected and make a political process could interfere with the obligation for effective enforcement of environmental law.
Ooh.
A zinger.
Let's set that over to the side and figure out what to recommend in the renegotiation of the USMCA in 2026 to address that.
Excellent.
Well, I know Scott has always been a troublemaker, and I'm glad he hasn't disappointed us today. Well, I get the sense after close to an hour and a half that Zoom fatigue, this malady of the 2020s, might be setting in out there. And those of you who know me, Scott only, but now Jennifer and Chuck, you know a little bit about me. I am that eternal, incurable optimist. So what I'm going to do is ask each one of you to lead us off on a high note with some closing remarks about how things will be better in the future with all of this and the international front on sustainability and the environment. Jennifer, I'll give you the first shot. Scott, you get the last word, and Chuck, wedge you in between. Jennifer, what's the outlook for the future on the positive side of things?
I think where I would go is how the number of players has increased in recent years. Like, again, I'm going to focus primarily in the climate context, but since the Paris Agreement was completed and entered into force, these annual meetings that happen under it have become really these big fora where all kinds of entities come together to show their commitments, what they're planning to do, what they have done to help address climate change. You kind of have to think of the 195 governments in the Paris Agreement as finding the lowest common denominator and egging each other on to do more. But where you can't achieve that across all those countries, you have subgroups, whether it's subgroups of governments, subgroups of companies, some groups of international financial institutions, using these occasions as impetus for announcing new pledges or announcing new collaborations, which I think is positive. I don't know what all will come out of the next conference in Baku, Azerbaijan next month. But we've talked a lot about climate finance. One of the things that I think is quite odd, but I'm watching, is that the Azerbaijani government has announced that they are creating a new climate fund, and the contributors to it will be fossil fuel countries and the fossil fuel industry. So we'll see what they come up with, but there are creative new ways to find money. So that's one positive.
Well, it's like robbing banks because that's where the money is, go
And
to
they
the
profited. So it's
yep.
the polluter paying if they put a lot of their profits into this fund.
Excellent.
Mhm.
Chuck, some final thoughts?
Yeah, so I'll make one macro suggestion and two micro. On the macro side, I think the transition is underway to a cleaner, more sustainable future. And the IEA, I think, and many others have pointed out the technologies are there. We just need to be able to get the finance more quickly to buy down the costs for it to succeed. So the path to net zero is there. It's evident. We just need to create the incentives I referred to earlier for them to happen. And in light of that, just a couple little things that I picked up in the news over the last couple of days that I found satisfying. One, I don't know how many of you heard this morning that in Arkansas, apparently they found a deposit that would be like the world's largest lithium deposit. I think the extractives group in the World Bank that I've been following a little bit from my retirement perch has pointed out the ability to increasingly find or recycle these rare earths and minerals that are critical for the clean technologies of the future. And the other is just one of my pet peeves have been driving through lovely Pennsylvania, Maryland countryside and seeing these solar panels covering arable, high quality farmland. Well, just this past week in the business section of the Post, I saw that in Texas, they are now grazing underneath the solar panels. And when you think of that as, meeting potentially both biodiversity, farmland, grazing, and energy production at the same time, there is hope that technologies are evolving fast enough to bring us potentially to where we need to be. So I'll leave it like that.
Very good. Scott, you've got a minute for the last word.
Okay. Pick up on two themes from what Chuck shared. One is that the private sector has arrived just in time. Governments, I think, are not getting the job done on climate change, and that's very unfortunate. But reinforcements are on the way. We just need to figure out how to harness that energy in the private sector to produce change, and that needs to be on a multi-sectoral basis. The fact of the matter is, we know how these things can be done in a sustainable way. That we don't need to be terribly inventive about. We kind of already know that, and we just need to make sure that that's what happens going forward. The other is technology. There's enormous promise on the technology front, ranging from just new ways of generating energy or sort of continuing thoughts about hydrogen and other sources of energy that can be an ever bigger part of the solution, but also in understanding the climate phenomenon and monitoring actions connected to that phenomenon. Big environmental data is on the rise, and it's going to become all the more important in how we understand the environment and our interventions related to the environment. And who knows, as terrifying and scary as AI can be, maybe the machines will even be able to help us find some solutions that we'd otherwise have a hard time working our way to ourselves. So I think the movement in the private sector and the promise of technology is where I draw hope.
Very good, Scott. I'm going to have the last word, which is going to be primarily to thank the three of you for sharing all of your experience and insights. Jennifer, I encourage you to join the EPA Alumni Association. Remember, it's free. We'll maybe ask you for a contribution here and there. Chuck, I think we could swing an honorary membership for you, but we all really
Would be honored.
appreciate your time today.